James Carter had always been a man of few words. A carpenter by trade, he had built a life of quiet routine in Clearwater, Idaho, a town small enough that everyone knew each other's business. For James, life revolved around his 12-year-old son, Ethan, a boy with a bright imagination and a love for painting. Ethan had inherited his father's introverted nature but expressed himself through his art, often losing himself in landscapes and portraits that seemed to leap off the canvas. But for all his talents, Ethan carried a burden he could never escape, a large, jagged birthmark on his face. The birthmark had been a topic of curiosity when Ethan was younger, with children innocently asking about it. As he grew older, however, curiosity turned to ridicule. Ethan's classmates gave him cruel nicknames, whispering behind his back. James did his best to shield his son, reassuring him that the mark was just a part of what made him unique. Ethan pretended to shrug it off, but James knew his son better than anyone. The way Ethan avoided mirrors and walked with his head down at school events spoke volumes. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything changed. James was in his workshop, sanding down a piece of cherrywood for a new table, when Ethan burst through the door. His son's face was streaked with tears, his clothes disheveled, and his school bag hung loosely from one shoulder. But it wasn't just Ethan's appearance that made James's stomach drop, it was the look in his eyes. A mix of fear, humiliation, and deep sadness. "Dad," Ethan choked out, his voice cracking. He held up his arms, revealing the bruises on his wrists. James immediately dropped the sander and rushed to his son, kneeling in front of him. "What happened? Who did this to you?" James's voice was calm, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. Ethan hesitated, his lip trembling. "It was at school," he said finally, looking away. "A bunch of kids, they cornered me after class." James's heart pounded in his chest. He had always feared this day would come but had hoped against hope that it wouldn't. "What did they do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They called me a monster," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "They pushed me around, laughed at me. And then they spray-painted my locker. Everyone saw." James's vision blurred with rage. He pulled Ethan into a tight hug, murmuring words of comfort even as his mind raced. His son, his sweet, talented boy, had been humiliated in front of the entire school. The thought of anyone hurting Ethan made his blood boil. That night, James sat by Ethan's bed long after his son had fallen asleep. He watched the slow rise and fall of Ethan's chest and felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had always prided himself on being able to fix things. With enough time and effort, any problem could be solved. But this wasn't a broken chair or a leaky roof. This was his son's spirit, crushed by cruelty, and James didn't know where to begin. The next morning, James marched into Clearwater Middle School, determined to get answers. The principal, a portly man named Mr. Hayes, greeted him with a strained smile. "Mr. Carter, what brings you here today?" James wasted no time. "My son was attacked yesterday," he said, his voice firm. "Bullied by a group of kids. I want to know what you're going to do about it." Mr. Hayes's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm afraid I'm not aware of any incident involving Ethan." James stared at him in disbelief. "Not aware? How could you not be aware? They spray-painted his locker. Don't you have cameras? Witnesses?" "We do have cameras, but unfortunately, the footage from yesterday's incident was inconclusive," Mr. Hayes said, shifting uncomfortably. "As for witnesses, no one has come forward." James clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. "So that's it? You're just going to sweep this under the rug?" "Mr. Carter, I assure you, we take bullying very seriously," Mr. Hayes replied. "But without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do." James left the office fuming. It was clear to him that the school was more interested in avoiding controversy than in protecting his son. That afternoon, he decided to confront the parents of the boys Ethan had identified as his tormentors. Armed with their names, James went door to door, hoping to find some measure of accountability. The first parent he spoke to, a woman named Linda, was defensive. "My son would never do something like that," she said, crossing her arms. "Ethan must be mistaken." James bit back his frustration. "Mistaken? He has bruises on his arms, Linda. And his locker was vandalized." "Maybe he's exaggerating," she replied. "Kids these days are so sensitive." At the next house, a man named Rick was even less sympathetic. "Boys will be boys," he said with a shrug. "It's not like anyone got hurt." James stared at him in disbelief. "Not hurt? My son is terrified to go back to school. Do you have any idea what this is doing to him?" Rick simply shook his head and shut the door in James's face. By the time James returned home, he was seething. The complete lack of accountability from both the school and the parents was infuriating. That evening, as Ethan sat silently at the dinner table, picking at his food, James made a decision. He couldn't rely on anyone else to protect his son. If the system wouldn't step in, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Over the next few days, James began formulating a plan. He spent hours researching bullying and its effects, reading heartbreaking stories of children who had been driven to despair. He also reached out to other parents in the community, hoping to find allies. To his surprise, several parents came forward, sharing their own stories of how their children had been bullied at Clearwater Middle School. It seemed Ethan's case was far from isolated. With their support, James organized a town meeting to address the issue. He spent every spare moment preparing, determined to make an impact. On the night of the meeting, the town hall was packed with parents, teachers, and students. James stood at the front of the room, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steadied despite the nerves coursing through him. "I'm here tonight as a father who is deeply concerned about the safety and well-being of our children." He went on to share Ethan's story, his voice breaking as he described the pain his son had endured. "No child should have to feel like they don't belong, like they're not good enough. And yet, that's exactly what's happening in our schools." As James spoke, he noticed heads nodding in agreement, parents exchanging looks of concern. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. But not everyone was on his side. A few parents accused him of exaggerating, of making their children look like villains. One man stood up and shouted, "Maybe if your son toughened up, he wouldn't have these problems." The room fell silent. James took a deep breath and met the man's gaze. "This isn't about toughness," he said calmly. "It's about teaching our kids to treat each other with respect. Because if we don't, we're failing them as parents, as teachers, as a community." The meeting ended with a resolution to form an anti-bullying task force, but James knew this was just the beginning. As he drove home that night, he glanced at Ethan, who had insisted on coming with him. His son's face was still pale, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope too. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to protect his son. And in doing so, he hoped to create a better world for all the children of Clearwater. James Carter awoke the next morning with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there the day before. The town meeting had sparked something in him, an awareness that he wasn't alone in this fight. Other parents shared his pain, their stories echoing his own frustrations. Still, the battle ahead loomed large. He knew that the path to change would be littered with obstacles, not the least of which was the apathy of the school administration and the hostility of those who refused to see the harm being done. Ethan, however, was still reluctant. At breakfast, he sat quietly, his spoon stirring his cereal aimlessly. James watched him from across the table, noticing the faint shadows under his son's eyes. The boy hadn't slept well in weeks, and James hated that he felt powerless to fix it. "Hey," James said gently, breaking the silence. "I know last night was a lot, but I'm proud of you for coming. You were brave." Ethan shrugged. "It didn't really change anything, did it?" James leaned forward, his expression firm but kind. "It's not going to happen overnight, bud. But standing up, making people listen, that's the first step. You'll see. Things will get better." Ethan didn't respond, but James could tell he wasn't convinced. The bruises on his wrists had faded slightly, but the emotional scars were still fresh. James resolved to push harder, to make sure Ethan saw a real change. Later that day, James returned to the school, this time with a small group of parents who had joined his cause. They met with Principal Hayes in his office, where James laid out their demands: a formal investigation into the bullying incidents, disciplinary actions against the perpetrators, and the implementation of anti-bullying programs. Principal Hayes, however, was less than receptive. "Mr. Carter, while I understand your concerns, we have protocols in place to handle these situations. It's not as simple as punishing a few kids." James's frustration boiled over. "Not as simple. My son was attacked, humiliated, and nothing has been done. How can you call this handling the situation?" Another parent, a woman named Karen, spoke up. "My daughter has been bullied for months, and I've filed multiple complaints. You've done nothing. How many more kids have to suffer before you take this seriously?" Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand your frustration, but these things take time. We're doing our best." "Your best isn't good enough," James shot back. "We're not leaving until we see real action." The meeting ended in a stalemate, with Hayes promising to look into their concerns but offering little in the way of concrete solutions. As they left the office, James turned to the other parents. "This isn't over. If the school won't act, we'll have to find another way." Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into the fight. He spent hours researching anti-bullying initiatives, reaching out to advocacy groups, and connecting with other parents who had experienced similar struggles. He learned about restorative justice programs, peer mediation, and the importance of creating a school culture that prioritized empathy and inclusion. James also began to notice something troubling. While some parents and community members rallied around him, others were less supportive. At the local grocery store, he overheard whispers as he walked past. At church, certain congregants avoided his gaze. It was clear that not everyone appreciated his efforts to shake up the status quo. One evening, James found a note taped to his front door. It read, "Mind your own business," scrawled in harsh, jagged letters. Beneath it was a crude drawing of a monster, eerily similar to the one spray-painted on Ethan's locker. James's hands trembled as he crumpled the note. It was one thing for kids to bully Ethan, but for an adult to target him for standing up for his son, it was almost too much to bear. James didn't tell Ethan about the note. He didn't want to add to his son's already heavy burden. Instead, he channeled his anger into action. He started writing letters to local newspapers, sharing Ethan's story and calling for community-wide change. He contacted the school board, demanding a public forum to address the issue of bullying. And he began organizing events to raise awareness, including a candlelight vigil for victims of bullying. The vigil was a turning point. Held in the town square, it drew a surprisingly large crowd, including students, teachers, and even some of the parents who had initially opposed James's efforts. As the sun set and the candles flickered to life, James took the stage to speak. "This isn't just about my son," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about every child who has ever felt like they didn't belong. Every child who has been made to feel small, unworthy, or unloved. We can't keep turning a blind eye to this. We have to do better, for them, and for each other." As James spoke, he saw tears in the eyes of some audience members. When he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. But not everyone was moved by his words. The next day, James received a call from the school, informing him that a group of parents had filed a complaint against him, accusing him of creating division in the community. James was stunned. He had expected resistance, but this felt like a betrayal. How could anyone see his fight for justice as anything other than necessary? That evening, as James sat in his workshop, the weight of the past weeks finally caught up with him. He felt exhausted, defeated. For the first time, he wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. But then Ethan walked in, holding one of his paintings, a vibrant, hopeful landscape of a sunrise over the mountains. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "thank you for standing up for me. I know it's been hard, but it means a lot." James's heart swelled with pride. He pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him tightly. "I'll always stand up for you," he said. "No matter what." That night, James resolved to keep going. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also knew it was worth it. For Ethan, for the other kids in the community, and for the future of Clearwater. The next morning, James got to work, more determined than ever. The fight was far from over, but he was ready to see it through. Little did he know, the biggest challenges, and the most unexpected twists, were yet to come. The days following the vigil marked a shift in Clearwater. For the first time, conversations about bullying began to dominate discussions in homes, at the local diner, and during school board meetings. James Carter had become an unwitting leader in a movement he hadn't intended to start. Parents, teachers, and even students were reaching out to him, sharing their stories and offering support. Yet, for all the progress being made, the resistance was equally fierce. The morning after the vigil, James received a call from a reporter at the Clearwater Gazette. The woman, Rachel Monroe, had attended the event and wanted to interview James for a feature on his efforts to combat bullying. At first, James hesitated. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, and the idea of his personal struggles being laid bare for the entire town to read was daunting. But after some thought, he agreed. If sharing his story could help even one other family, it was worth it. Rachel arrived at James's modest home later that afternoon. Ethan, who had been reluctant to meet anyone new since the bullying began, stayed upstairs. James welcomed Rachel into his living room, where she set up her recorder and notebook. "Mr. Carter," Rachel began, "your story has resonated with a lot of people in this community. Why do you think that is?" James leaned back in his chair, considering his answer. "I think it's because it's not just my story. It's a story that so many families here have lived through but haven't had the chance, or the courage, to talk about. Bullying isn't just a kid's issue, it's a community issue. And for too long, we've been ignoring it." Rachel nodded, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "You've faced a lot of backlash as well. How do you respond to those who say you're causing division?" James's jaw tightened. He had heard that criticism more times than he cared to count. "Division was already there," he said firmly. "I didn't create it. But if shining a light on it makes people uncomfortable, then maybe that's a good thing. Change doesn't happen without a little discomfort." The interview lasted over an hour, and by the time Rachel left, James felt both drained and invigorated. He had spoken from the heart, and he hoped his words would resonate. Little did he know, the article that Rachel was writing would soon ignite a firestorm. When the story was published 2 days later, it painted a vivid picture of the struggles James and Ethan had faced and highlighted the broader issue of bullying in Clearwater. The piece was compassionate but unflinching, and it called out the school's administration for its inaction. It also named the parents who had filed the complaint against James, a detail that Rachel had included despite his reservations. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some readers praised James for his courage and began rallying around his cause, organizing fundraisers and offering to volunteer for the anti-bullying programs he was trying to implement. Others, however, were furious. The parents named in the article felt publicly shamed, and their anger quickly turned into a smear campaign against James. They claimed he was exploiting his son's pain for attention and accused him of fabricating parts of the story. James tried to rise above the attacks, but the strain was taking a toll on him. He noticed that Ethan was growing quieter, retreating further into himself. The boy had stopped painting, and his sketchbook remained untouched on his desk. James's heart broke every time he saw it. One evening, Ethan finally opened up. "Dad, why do they hate us so much?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I thought you were trying to help." James knelt in front of him, looking him in the eye. "Sometimes, when people are scared or feel guilty, they lash out. They don't want to admit they're wrong, so they try to make someone else the bad guy. But that doesn't mean we're wrong for standing up for what's right." Ethan nodded, but James could tell his words hadn't fully sunk in. Still, he hoped they planted a seed of resilience in his son. A week later, things escalated. Late one night, James was woken by the sound of shattering glass. He bolted out of bed and rushed to the living room, where he found the front window smashed. A brick lay on the floor amid shards of glass, and attached to it was a note, "Stop or else." James's hands shook as he read the note. He immediately called the police, but when they arrived, they were less than helpful. "It's probably just a prank," the officer said with a shrug. "Kids being kids. Kids don't write notes like this," James shot back. "This is harassment. It's a threat." The officer sighed. "We'll file a report, but there's not much we can do without witnesses." After the officers left, James spent the rest of the night boarding up the window. Ethan stayed by his side, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "We can't let them win, Dad," he said quietly. James looked at his son, his resolve hardening. "We won't." The next morning, James took the note to Rachel Monroe. She was appalled and promised to include it in a follow-up article about the backlash he was facing. But before the piece could be published, another twist occurred. James received an anonymous email from someone claiming to have information about the group targeting him. The email included screenshots of a private social media group where several parents, along with a handful of students, were openly discussing ways to intimidate James into silence. The messages ranged from mocking Ethan's birthmark to suggesting they vandalize James's property. James was both furious and sickened. He forwarded the screenshots to the local police, the school board, and Rachel. This time, there was no brushing it off as a prank. The exposure of the social media group was a turning point. The parents involved were publicly shamed, and a few even lost their jobs as a result. The school board, under mounting pressure, finally agreed to implement mandatory anti-bullying training for students and staff. Principal Hayes, who had been resistant from the start, resigned amid the controversy. But the victory felt hollow to James. The damage had already been done, to Ethan, to their family, and to the community. The fight had taken so much out of him, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to keep going. One afternoon, as James sat in his workshop, Ethan came in holding his sketchbook. "I drew something," he said, his voice tentative. "I wanted you to see it." James took the sketchbook and opened it to find a drawing of a tree. Its trunk was scarred and gnarled, but its branches reached upward, covered in vibrant leaves. At the base of the tree stood two figures, a man and a boy, their faces turned toward the sky. "It's us," Ethan said. "No matter what happens, we keep growing." James felt a lump rise in his throat. He pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him tightly. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "And so am I." The road ahead was still uncertain, but in that moment, James knew they would be okay. They had weathered the storm together, and together, they would continue to fight, not just for themselves, but for every child who deserved to feel safe, valued, and loved. The weeks following the exposure of the private social media group were a whirlwind for James Carter. The town of Clearwater was reeling from the revelations. The parents and students who had been involved in the group faced significant backlash, and while some issued public apologies, others doubled down on their behavior, claiming they were being unfairly vilified. For James, the victory was bittersweet. While the school board had finally agreed to implement anti-bullying measures, the cost of that progress weighed heavily on him and Ethan. Ethan returned to school shortly after the changes were announced, but the scars of his experiences were still visible. On his first day back, James drove him to school, parking the car in front of the building. Ethan sat silently in the passenger seat, staring at the entrance. His hands gripped the straps of his backpack tightly, and James could see the nervous energy radiating off him. "You ready?" James asked gently, his voice steady. Ethan shook his head. "Not really," he admitted. "What if they don't stop, Dad? What if it just gets worse?" James reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "You've already faced the worst of it, and you're still standing. That takes courage. If anything happens, you let me know. We're in this together." Ethan nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. James watched as his son walked into the school, his head held slightly higher than before. He wanted to believe that things would be better, but a part of him couldn't shake the fear that Ethan's tormentors, or their enablers, would find new ways to strike. As it turned out, the changes at Clearwater Middle School didn't take effect as smoothly as James had hoped. The new anti-bullying programs were met with resistance from some students and even a few teachers who felt that the measures were overly strict or unnecessary. James began hearing reports from other parents about subtle pushback, students refusing to participate in workshops, parents complaining that their children were being unfairly labeled as bullies, and even some teachers expressing frustration with the additional training sessions. One day, James received a call from the school counselor, Ms. Fletcher, who had recently been hired as part of the school's new initiative. She sounded both concerned and determined. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to update you on Ethan's progress," she began. "He's been attending the group therapy sessions we started for students who've experienced bullying, and he's doing well. But there's something I think you should know." James's heart sank. "What is it?" "There's still tension in the school," Ms. Fletcher admitted. "Some of the students who were disciplined for their involvement in the bullying incidents are retaliating in smaller, less obvious ways. We're monitoring the situation closely, but I thought you should be aware." James felt a familiar surge of anger and frustration. "What kind of retaliation?" he asked. "Things like whisper campaigns, exclusion, and subtle digs that are hard to pin down as outright bullying," Ms. Fletcher explained. "Ethan hasn't reported anything directly, but I can tell he's still wary. I wanted to let you know so you can keep an eye on him." "Thank you," James said, his voice tight. "I appreciate you letting me know." After the call, James sat in his workshop, trying to process what he had heard. He felt like he was fighting a hydra. Every time he cut off one head, another grew in its place. But giving up wasn't an option. He had come too far, and Ethan needed him to be strong. That evening, James decided to address the issue head-on. He sat down with Ethan after dinner, the two of them side by side on the couch. "Ms. Fletcher called me today," James began. "She said you've been doing well in therapy, but she also mentioned there's still some tension at school. Is there anything you want to talk about?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "It's not as bad as before," he said finally. "But yeah, some kids are still mean. They don't say things outright, but you can tell they're talking about you. And sometimes they won't sit next to me in class or include me in group projects." James's chest tightened. He hated that his son had to endure this. "I'm proud of you for handling it," he said. And I want you to know that you don't have to face it alone. If anything happens, anything at all, you tell me. Okay? Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening. Okay. The next day, James decided to visit the school unannounced. He wanted to see firsthand how the new programs were being implemented and whether the environment was truly changing. When he arrived, he was greeted by Ms. Fletcher, who seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Mr. Carter, it's good to see you," she said. "What brings you here today?" "I wanted to check in," James said. "I've been hearing mixed things about how the changes are going, and I thought it might be helpful to see for myself." Ms. Fletcher nodded. "I understand. Let me give you a tour." As they walked through the hallways, James noticed a few things that gave him hope. Posters promoting kindness and inclusion adorned the walls, and bulletin boards featured student artwork and messages of support for bullying victims. But he also saw students huddled in groups, their eyes darting toward him before breaking into whispers. He could feel the tension in the air. In one classroom, he observed a peer mediation session where students were encouraged to resolve conflicts through open dialogue. The facilitator, a young teacher named Mr. Harper, seemed enthusiastic and engaged, but some of the students looked bored or dismissive. "It's a work in progress," Ms. Fletcher admitted as they left the classroom. "We're making strides, but cultural change takes time." James nodded, his jaw tight. Time is a luxury some kids don't have. The visit left James with mixed feelings. He could see that some positive changes were happening, but he also knew that the underlying issues ran deep. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, he began drafting a plan. He wanted to create a community-wide initiative that extended beyond the school, something that involved parents, local businesses, and organizations. He envisioned workshops, mentorship programs, and town hall meetings where people could share their stories and learn from one another. James called Rachel Monroe, the journalist who had written about his story, and shared his idea. Rachel was immediately supportive. "This could be exactly what Clearwater needs," she said. "A way to bring the community together instead of dividing it further. Let me know how I can help." Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into organizing the initiative, which he called Clearwater Strong. He reached out to local leaders, gathered volunteers, and secured funding from a few supportive businesses. The first event was a community forum held at the town hall, where parents, teachers, and students were invited to share their experiences and discuss solutions. The forum was a turning point. Parents who had been skeptical of James's efforts began to see the value in addressing the issue head-on. Students who had once been afraid to speak up found their voices. Even some of the parents who had initially opposed James came forward to apologize, admitting that they had been wrong to dismiss the problem. But not everyone was willing to change. One father, whose son had been one of Ethan's tormentors, stood up during the forum and launched into a tirade. "This whole thing is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "Kids will be kids. You can't coddle them forever. Maybe if some parents taught their kids to toughen up, we wouldn't be here." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to James. He stood, his expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about coddling," he said. "It's about teaching our kids to be better, to be kinder, more empathetic, and more respectful. Because if we don't, we're setting them up for failure in life. Bullying isn't just a harmless rite of passage. It's a serious issue that can leave lasting scars. And it's our job as parents, teachers, and community members to do something about it." The man muttered something under his breath and sat down, but the room erupted in applause. James felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it felt like the tide was truly turning. As the forum ended, Ethan approached James with a small smile. "You were amazing, Dad," he said. "I'm glad you didn't give up." James ruffled his son's hair. "I didn't give up because of you," he said. "You're my inspiration." That night, as they drove home, James looked at Ethan and felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The road ahead was still long, but they were no longer walking it alone. Together, with the support of their community, they were building something stronger, something that could withstand the storms of the future. The morning after the first Clearwater Strong Forum, James Carter woke up feeling a rare sense of optimism. The previous night's event had exceeded his expectations, drawing more attendees than he could have imagined. Parents, teachers, and students had shared their stories with a raw honesty that had touched everyone in the room. For the first time, James felt the community shifting, however slightly, toward unity. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. Ethan seemed lighter, too. At breakfast, he ate with more appetite than usual and even cracked a small joke about the mountain of dishes piling up in the sink. James laughed, savoring the moment. His son had been through so much, and seeing him smile felt like a reward for all the battles they had fought together. But Clearwater's transformation wasn't without resistance. By midday, James's phone was flooded with messages, some supportive and others vitriolic. The Clearwater Gazette had published an article about the forum, and while many praised the event, there were vocal critics who felt that James was stirring up unnecessary drama. Some anonymous commenters accused him of exploiting Ethan's story for attention, while others mocked the initiative outright. James tried to brush it off, but one comment stuck with him: "You can't fix Clearwater by holding hands and singing songs. Real change requires action, not just words." It wasn't the cruelty of the comment that bothered him, it was the truth hidden within it. The forum had been a good start, but words alone wouldn't solve the deep-rooted problems in Clearwater. If James wanted to create lasting change, he needed to go further. That afternoon, James met with Rachel Monroe at the local diner. The journalist had become one of his staunchest allies, and he trusted her insight. "The forum was great, but it's just the beginning," James said as he sipped his coffee. "We need something tangible, something that will show people this isn't just about talking. We need action." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. Have you considered organizing a community service project? Something that involves everyone, parents, students, teachers. It could be a way to rebuild trust and show that this isn't about blame, but about working together." James's mind raced with possibilities. "That's a great idea," he said. "Maybe we could renovate the park near the school. It's been falling apart for years, and it's a place where a lot of kids hang out. If we fix it up, it could be a symbol of what we're trying to achieve, a better, safer environment for everyone." Rachel smiled. "I love it. Let me know how I can help." Over the next few days, James threw himself into planning the project. He reached out to local businesses for donations of materials, recruited volunteers from the Clearwater Strong Network, and even convinced the school board to allow students to earn community service credits for participating. The project quickly gained momentum, and soon the entire town was buzzing with excitement. The day of the park renovation arrived on a crisp Saturday morning. Dozens of people showed up, armed with tools, paint, and a shared determination to make a difference. James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he looked around at the diverse group of volunteers. There were parents and children, teachers and students, and even a few of the parents who had initially opposed his efforts. Ethan worked alongside his father, helping to repaint the playground equipment. For the first time in months, he seemed at ease, laughing and joking with some of the other kids. James watched him out of the corner of his eye, his heart swelling with pride. The park transformation unfolded like a well-orchestrated symphony. While some volunteers repaired broken benches and cleaned up litter, others planted flowers and repainted faded murals on the walls of the nearby community center. By the time the sun began to set, the park was nearly unrecognizable. The once dilapidated playground now gleamed with fresh paint, the overgrown grass had been trimmed, and colorful flower beds lined the pathways. As the volunteers gathered for a group photo, James stood at the center, holding Ethan close. "This is what Clearwater Strong is all about," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about coming together to create something better, for our kids, for ourselves, and for our community. Thank you all for being a part of this." The applause was deafening, and James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that Clearwater could truly change. But as with every step of his journey, progress brought its own set of challenges. In the weeks following the park renovation, James began to notice a troubling pattern. While many in the community embraced the changes, there was still a vocal minority determined to undermine his efforts. Anonymous flyers started appearing around town, accusing James of pushing an agenda and questioning his motives. Some even suggested that Clearwater Strong was a cover for political ambitions, a notion that James found laughable but infuriating. One evening, as James was working in his garage, Ethan walked in holding one of the flyers. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "why do people hate you so much? You're just trying to help." James sighed, setting down his tools. "Not everyone likes change, Ethan," he said. "Sometimes it's easier for people to lash out than to admit they were wrong. But we can't let that stop us. What we're doing matters." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll ever stop?" James hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But even if they don't, we'll keep going. Because this isn't about them, it's about making things better for everyone." The conversation stayed with James as he continued his work. He knew the resistance he faced was a sign that he was making an impact, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Still, he pressed on, focusing on the positive changes that were starting to take root in Clearwater. One of the most significant changes came from an unexpected source. A few weeks after the park renovation, James received a call from Linda, one of the parents who had initially dismissed Ethan's bullying as kids being kids. Her voice was tentative, almost apologetic. "James," she said, "I owe you an apology. I didn't want to see it before, but now I do. My son was one of the kids who hurt Ethan, and I've been trying to figure out how to make things right." James was taken aback. "Thank you, Linda," he said. "That means a lot. What made you change your mind?" "It was the park project," she admitted. "Seeing everyone come together like that, it made me realize that I was wrong. I let my pride get in the way, and I'm sorry." James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thank you," he said again. "That means more than you know." The conversation marked a turning point, not just for Linda but for the entire community. Slowly but surely, more parents began to come forward, acknowledging their mistakes and committing to making things better. The school's anti-bullying programs gained traction, with participation rates steadily climbing. Students who had once been apathetic began to take the issue seriously, organizing their own initiatives to promote kindness and inclusion. Through it all, James remained steadfast. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew that Clearwater was on the right path. And as he watched Ethan flourish, his confidence returning, his art blossoming once again, James felt a sense of fulfillment that no amount of criticism could take away. One evening, as they sat on the front porch, Ethan turned to his father with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he said, "do you think Clearwater will ever be perfect?" James smiled, draping an arm around his son's shoulders. "No place is perfect," he said. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it better. And as long as we keep trying, I think we'll be okay." Ethan nodded, leaning into his father's embrace. For the first time in a long time, James felt a profound sense of peace. They had come a long way, and though the journey wasn't over, they were no longer walking it alone. Together, with the support of their community, they were building something stronger, a future where every child felt safe, valued, and loved. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, bathing Clearwater in a warm, golden glow. James Carter stood on the porch of his modest home, sipping his morning coffee as the town slowly came to life. He had always loved this time of day, the quiet before the rush, when the world seemed full of promise. But today was different. Today marked the one-year anniversary of the first Clearwater Strong Forum, a milestone that filled James with both pride and reflection. The past year had been a whirlwind of change. The community had grown closer in some ways and more divided in others. The anti-bullying programs at Clearwater Middle School were now fully implemented, and while they had made a significant difference, they hadn't completely eradicated the problem. Change, James had learned, was never a straight path. It was a series of steps forward and backward, of victories and setbacks. But it was worth every moment, because the progress they had made was undeniable. Ethan, now 13, was thriving in a way James had scarcely dared to hope for a year ago. He had regained his confidence, reconnected with old friends, and even made a few new ones. His art had become a powerful outlet, and his paintings now adorned the walls of their home, each one a testament to his resilience and creativity. One of his pieces, a vibrant mural of interconnected hands, had even been chosen to hang in the school's main hallway, a symbol of unity and strength. James's reverie was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Ethan, still groggy from sleep, but with a faint smile on his face. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, buddy," James replied, ruffling his son's hair. "Big day today. You ready?" Ethan nodded, his smile growing. "Yeah. I think so." The day's agenda was packed. Clearwater Strong was hosting its largest event yet, a town-wide festival celebrating community resilience. There would be music, food, games, and a series of speeches from students, parents, and teachers who had been part of the movement. Ethan had been invited to speak, a fact that had initially terrified him but that he had come to embrace as an opportunity to share his story. By mid-morning, the town square was buzzing with activity. Booths lined the streets, each one showcasing a different aspect of the community's progress. Local businesses had donated food and supplies, and volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and decorations. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped Clearwater. As James and Ethan arrived, they were greeted with waves and smiles. People stopped to thank James for his efforts, their gratitude genuine and heartfelt. It was a far cry from the hostility he had faced in the early days of Clearwater Strong, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. The festival kicked off with a performance by the school choir, their voices harmonizing beautifully as they sang a song about hope and unity. Ethan stood beside James, his eyes shining as he watched his classmates perform. When the song ended, the crowd erupted in applause, and the festival officially began. Ethan's speech was scheduled for the afternoon, and as the time approached, James could see the nerves creeping in. Ethan fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, his eyes darting around the crowd. "Hey," James said, kneeling down to meet his son's gaze. "You've got this. Just speak from the heart. Everyone here is rooting for you." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "Okay," he said. "I'll try." When Ethan's name was called, the crowd quieted. He stepped onto the small stage, clutching the microphone tightly. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of faces, his expression unsure. But then his eyes found James, who gave him an encouraging nod, and something shifted. Ethan straightened his posture, took another deep breath, and began to speak. "Hi, everyone," he said, his voice steady but soft. "My name is Ethan Carter, and I want to tell you a little bit about what Clearwater Strong means to me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A year ago, I was in a really bad place. I was scared to go to school, scared to even leave my house. I felt like I didn't belong, like I wasn't good enough. But then my dad stood up for me. He didn't just fight for me, he fought for all of us. And because of him, and because of all of you, things started to change." Ethan's voice grew stronger as he continued. Clearwater Strong isn't just about stopping bullying. It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and valued. It's about showing kindness, even when it's hard. And it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. He looked directly at James, his eyes shining with gratitude. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for my dad. He taught me that it's okay to be different, that it's okay to be myself. And he showed me that one person can make a difference. The crowd erupted in applause, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. Ethan stepped off the stage, and James pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "You were amazing." The rest of the festival was a blur of laughter, celebration, and connection. People shared stories, made new friends, and recommitted themselves to the ideals of Clearwater Strong. By the time the sun began to set, the town square was bathed in a warm, golden light, and James felt a profound sense of peace. As the festival wound down, James stood on the edge of the square, watching the crowd disperse. Ethan was off with a group of friends, laughing and playing, his face glowing with happiness. James took a deep breath, savoring the moment. They had come so far, and while there was still work to be done, he knew they were on the right path. Rachel Monroe approached him, her notebook in hand. "Quite a day, huh?" she said with a smile. James nodded. "Yeah. It's been incredible." Rachel tilted her head, studying him. "So, what's next for Clearwater Strong?" James thought for a moment, a small smile playing on his lips. "We keep going," he said. "There's always more to do. But today feels like a good place to start." Rachel nodded, jotting down his words. "I think you're right." As the last of the festival-goers drifted away, James and Ethan walked home together, the cool evening air wrapping around them. For the first time in a long time, James felt a deep sense of hope, not just for himself and Ethan, but for the entire community. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and that strength would carry them forward. As they reached their front porch, Ethan turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he said, "do you think people will remember this day?" James smiled, draping an arm around his son's shoulders. "I think so," he said. "But more importantly, I think they'll remember what it stands for. And that's what really matters." Ethan nodded, a contented smile spreading across his face. Together, they stepped inside, ready to face whatever the future held, stronger, braver, and more united than ever before.